bad novels aside, bad poetry is probably the biggest bane of existence in the writing world, at least according to this book, In Search of the World's Worst Authors by Nick Page. This is not an incredibly modern set of bad authors. It's literally going back into 1600s up to the mid 1900s. So the run of authors is not like modern authors, and the majority of them are poetry. There's a very, very few that are bad novels, and Nick Page kind of focuses, sometimes the author might not have necessarily been considered a bad author at the time. Some of them definitely were. There was one in particular that Mark Twain apparently would have been very at home with Mystery Science Theater and bashing bad movies, because he seemed quite the fan of bad poetry and bad writing. In fact, one of the guys that's in here, he writes about in The Innocents Abroad, because it was a person who was on the ship who apparently was just like inflicting everyone with his terrible poetry, because he was writing it about all this stuff on the ship they were on. So Mark Twain kind of, there was a circle of people, of authors and different people who just sort of appreciated the poetry for being bad. Some of this is stuff that the people I've researched and looked at, they are kind of considered, oh, that was just an early author, and nobody but Nick Page mentions that they were bad. So this is maybe just an opinion sort of a thing. On the other hand, the poetry is not distinctly good. There's nothing about it that I would say is anything really interesting. There's one author who writes in great detail. He only wrote poems about cheese that he published. There are some that are just, they like making up words. Some of it is a little bit a disconnect with what words meant back at that time and what words meant now. Or what they mean now. So some of that is a little along the lines of those things just don't sound the same any longer. And because of that, the poetry has kind of a confusing edge to it. Some of it you can just tell that whoever wrote the poetry did not have good grammar grasp. There's some confusing subject matter, like confusing the subject and what's going on in the poem. There's a lot of that. There's a few real standouts in here. In particular, you've got Pedro Carolino, who basically, he wrote a translation of a new guide of the conversation in Portuguese and English. He did not speak these languages. He was using a French dictionary to translate Portuguese into English. So the phrases you were getting were just absolute nonsense. And apparently this was so very, very popular because of how badly all this translated, that he had quite the following of people who thought that this was Mark Twain. Again, this was another one Mark Twain just thought was hilarious. And this translator who was just so sure of his skills that he did not even know the language he was translating the stuff into. So he was using another translation. So as you can see how garbled that would get as it goes. Then you've got... my sticky notes are coming off. Then you've got James Henry Powell, who basically was just one of the most... He was just one of the most depressing authors you would ever see in your life, where he basically writes about disasters. And I've found that there is such a thing. There was back in the day, and I say this as somebody who is just like a disaster podcast addict and a disaster YouTube channel addict. That's more than true crime. That's actually, even though true crime is something I like and whatever, the thing that I like research and like to watch the most or listen to the most is disaster. So I do understand how that probably has always been a thing. but he just is the worst about here. Here's the title of one of the celebrated poems: Lines written to a friend on the death of his brother caused by a railway train running over him while he was in a state of inebriation. That's the title of the poem. It only gets better from there, as you can imagine. So you've got this man who is just the most depressing about everything he writes about. You've got Alfred Austin, who was considered... Now, this one's actually kind of weirdly interesting historically, because Alfred Austin was Britain's poet laureate, but the reason he was chosen was basically because he was friends with somebody who was kind of in office. It really, when Tennyson died, the government cast around for replacements. Queen Victoria discussed the matter with Gladstone, who is reputed to have said, "I am told that Mr. Swinburne is the best poem in my dominions," which raises the intriguing prospect of a sadomasochistic poet laureate, because Swinburne has his own issues with a penchant for blah, 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 blah. In the event, it was left to another PM, Lord Salisbury, to make the decision. Of the frontrunners, none was an obvious choice. Everybody who was at the time, who was a big poet, kind of had all these issues with them. Thus it was that Salisbury turned to one of his own kind. He offered the job to a political crony, Alfred Austin, a leader writer for the conservative paper The Standard, and author of some very bad verse. He... Unfortunately for poor Austin, he seems to have taken all this to heart, that he actually was a good author, or a good poet. So the whole thing, it basically, all the big name poets in England at the time after Tennyson's death were just too controversial to be chosen as the poet laureate. So they just choose a really bad poet who just kind of falls in line, that he's kind of harmless and that they can control him. You've got James Whitcomb Riley, who he just really, he likes this cutesy, horrible dialectic stuff that just is terrible. He does one called "Dat Little Boy," which is supposed to be in like a Dutch dialect, which I feel is like somehow offensive, yet not. "It's a little Christmas story that I told der little folks, and I wanted to stop that laughing and cracking funny jokes." This poem goes on for a while. This is what this author, he is from Indiana, and he died in 1916. But he was all about this sort of just making up words. "The Crankadox leaned o'er the edge of the moon and wistfully gazed on the sea." I'm going to say that that was probably, we have some Lewis Carroll kind of in some of this, but this is not really good Lewis Carroll. This is, "How slight a thing may set one's fancy drifting upon the dead sea of the past. A view, sometimes an odor, or a rooster lifting a far-off ooh, ooh, ooh," which clearly the man has never heard a rooster. Which is shocking coming from Indiana. You'd think that would have happened. Just bad poetry for so many reasons. Just so many authors in here with so much bad poetry. Now, of course, the big name one is not the grandmother of them all. Is we also have the Titanic, the disaster poets in here. That seems to have been a thing. There is such a thing as disaster dishes. It was like, when does this specifically maritime mining ones happened a lot. They would make these dishes of the disaster that are very like quaint and folk art looking, and sell them at the very odd type of a thing. I'm not sure why we need commemorative items of disasters. It's just kind of an odd thing, but disaster poetry was also a very big deal. But Amanda McKittrick Ross was probably the big one that people might have heard of, because she wrote Irene Iddesleigh, which is considered like the worst novel ever written in history. She gets her own chapter in here. But if you are interested in just some terrible, terrible poetry for a variety of reasons, some of them being completely inoffensive just because the wording they were using, some of them just the one who just wrote about nothing but depressing stuff all the time. I feel like this was a man who was just going through it, and he was that guy that just rained on everybody's parade whenever anything was happening, and decided to do it in verse, but thought he was being artsy about it. So this is an entertaining book. It is for people who are interested in just everything bad. If you like bad movies, if you get a kick out of bad books in general, this is probably the book for you. This is kind of a preface to where I've been trying to read novels that are bad novels written by relatively good authors. If you're just looking for bad novels, you can find, since self-publishing, you can kind of find that everywhere. So you kind of have to qualify that it's a bad novel by a generally respected author, at least well-known author. Don't know how respected some of these authors that I found are, but anyway, so that's kind of a falling in line with all of that. I also, like I said, I watch or read a lot of disaster books, so I figured I might as well just start keeping with some of that as well. So I have a list of disaster books I'm going to start going through here as well too. I've got a lot of books I'm like kind of in the halfway point of. I don't think I can get into the autobiography, Tom Felton's autobiography. I think that's just going to have to go back to the library, because it is just, he's not a bad writer, but I'm not a massive Harry Potter fan, and God love, he seems to be trying to, or somebody told him to. I don't think he is that interested. He just seems interested in carp fishing, oddly enough. But it seems like he was told, much like Sam Hogan was told, you need to really focus on this niche audience. So he is just throwing like Harry Potter lingo in his writing all the time, and it's kind of annoying. It makes the book feel like it was written for a sixth grader when it isn't. When you're reading it and you're like, no, this stuff is not stuff that a sixth grader would read and write about. But he keeps throwing all this Muggle, Gryffindor type of terminology that I guess he's supposed to be. You can tell somebody told him to do this. I don't think he would have done this naturally. I really don't. Because he even talks about he doesn't want to be defined by Harry Potter, and yet he's here writing a book that is basically pandering to Harry Potter fans. So I feel bad, because I think I would finish the book and really read it if it was not so annoyingly trying to fit into Harry Potter, not nostalgia. It's not even nostalgia. It fit into Harry Potter like fandom. It's very annoying. The wording is so annoying, and I feel like this poor guy did not do this on his own. This was basically somebody telling him that he needed to use these terms, and maybe helping ghostwrite the stuff. I don't know, but because you can tell what he's passionate about, and he's passionate about carp fishing, which is sort of funny. But the relating of his Harry Potter experiences, which I can tell that they are trying to push in this, much like Hogan, who just wanted to hike, you could kind of tell. It's very much trying to push to get your audience engaged. Like, your audience picked this up because you were in Harry Potter, or your audience picked this up because they were into Outlander and want to hear all about your Outlander experiences and this and that. And for these people, it's just kind of like their day job. So there's a level to me that part is boring, and they almost feel like it's kind of I mean, there's some anecdote here and there with different things, but it's not really that that juicy. It's that sort of a thing. It's an interesting thing. I'm trying to see if this is something that is holding true with these modern kind of niche biographies, that people who are into certain fandoms are clearly trying to, or somebody, their publisher, somebody, marketing, is trying to capitalize on their niche fandom. And you're not getting really, I would almost feel like a book by Tom Felton about carp fishing would be more interesting, because clearly that's what the man's interested in, what he's passionate about. I'm sure he's got some great wild carp fishing stories that they didn't let him put in there just out of oddness, and I'm sure Hogan has some interesting like hiking stuff, and if they just let him go hike, it's very clearly taking somebody who's interested in a certain thing but has a job that is a certain fandom that everyone's trying to capitalize on. So it's an interesting, weird thing, and I'm going to try to see if this keeps going, this trend keeps going with modern autobiographies of people. So I'm going to see if I can find some as I'm going through the library here. I can't finish the Harry Potter-ness, so just be warned if you're going to pick up that Tom Felton one, that it is almost written in such a twee way that you're just like, oh my gosh, if he calls them Gryffindorks one more time, I am just going to throw this book across the room, because this is... Who writes like this? No one writes like this. It's way more annoying than Hogan's was. It's way more annoying because you can tell that somebody told him to put all this Harry Potter vocabulary and the muggles and this and that and all this sort of thing in there. And it's just tell me about the carp fishing. Just tell me about the carp fishing. Tell me about how you stepped on Alan Rickman's robe like 20 million times and he like scared the crap out of you because he had enough of it. Just tell that sort of stuff instead of the whole twee vocabulary that is kind of in there. So that is where I am at this point. I'm kind of in the middle of a whole bunch of things. I'll probably get done with the Tennessee history fact weirdness book first, because I have a list of that, and I'm teaching Tennessee history next year, so that list was more beneficial to get through. But have some bad poetry and make your day a little better.